title of my talk is Living on the Edge on Critical Brain Dynamics as a framework for assessing and regulating brain function. And those concepts will be clarified in a moment. So I'd like to start with a short story. Peter Tripp was a famous radio DJ at the time, and in January 1959, he stayed awake for over 200 hours. He did that to raise money for charity. After a few days, he started to hallucinate, and he suffered from other psychological issues. And actually, he never recovered. He never completely recovered. Maybe some of you know that sleep deprivation triggers hallucinations. It also triggers epileptic seizures. And it's related to what we call the balance of excitation and inhibition. So if we would zoom into our brain, a certain cortical circuit, we would see that there are excitatory and inhibitory neurons at a constant interplay. And it's very important that those patterns of activity or firing of those neurons are balanced. So excitation is always balanced by inhibition, and it's a very subtle balance. Now, if the balance is perturbed, we can have, for example, overexcitation, which can manifest as hallucinations. It would create some kind of persistent activity in a recurrent network. And if this network is associated with sensory processing, what can happen is that this network will be active even in the absence of objective input from the outside. So it's a sensory network that is now active, and our brains mistake it for some kind of an external sensory input, although there's nothing, and we hallucinate. And imbalance of excitation and inhibition could also lead to abnormal activity in the form of high synchrony that could appear as an epileptic seizure, for example, which again could manifest as hallucination if it's in a sensory area, or some kind of abnormal motor activity, convulsion if it's in a motor area. Now, the framework of critical brain dynamics is closely related to this issue of balance of excitation and inhibition, as I will show in a moment. And it's essentially a very convenient framework to deal with that and connect it to some disturbances that are associated with the imbalance of excitation and inhibition. The basic hypothesis that people in this community of critical brain dynamics have come up with in recent years, I would say in the last 2 decades, is that our brains operate near the border, on the edge, between what we could call underamplification of neural activity and overamplification. On the one side, we have what we call the subcritical regime, where inhibition dominates. On the other side, we have the supercritical regime, where excitation dominates, and we can have runaway excitation of activity. And on the subcritical side, activity may die out prematurely. And we believe that our brain evolves to operate near this critical zone. We also refer mostly to the cortex. And there's a certain mathematical framework that comes from math and physics. It's not related just to neuroscience, but it's very general and universal. And it turns out that it's very useful to describe this idea of brain dynamics and the hypothesis of critical brain dynamics and its implications. So let's try to show that. Now, what we find, and as I'll try to convince you later on, is that measures that are based on this idea of critical brain dynamics, and it actually translates to very concrete analysis that we can apply to EEG data or MEG, for example. We can derive from these analyses potential neuromarkers, biomarkers for neural activity that may be helpful for diagnosing different disorders such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, disorders of consciousness, mild cognitive impairment. All of them are related to some extent to altered balance of excitation and inhibition. Not just epilepsy clearly, but for example, mild cognitive impairment is a precursor of Alzheimer's. We know that often before Alzheimer's starts, there are epileptic seizures. And it's also associated with imbalance of excitation and inhibition. In schizophrenia, we have hallucinations of a very specific nature, verbal, auditory verbal hallucinations. And in disorders of consciousness, we also see signatures of deviation from correct balance. The brain becomes actually more inhibitory or more disconnected. So what I'll try now is to turn this from some kind of intuitions or hand-waving into something more concrete. So I have to briefly introduce to you this world of phase transitions and critical phenomena in physics. We are all familiar with critical phenomena, like water that can turn from liquid to solid at 0 temperature Celsius, or, for example, a piece of iron can become a magnet if it's cooled down below a certain temperature, and if we heat it up above this critical temperature, it stops being a magnet anymore. And it turns out that at the critical point, at the critical temperature in the case of these physical systems, we have some unique behavior, which is very interesting, and it doesn't happen if you are far away from this critical point in either direction. So one thing that we see is the scale-free dynamics. We see that some mathematical quantities behave like power laws. A power law is any function that is like s to p of s goes like s to the power of minus alpha. That's a power law. And if we plot it in log-log coordinates, we get a straight line. The slope of the straight line is called the exponent. And it turns out that not only we have these scale-free dynamics, fractal behavior, even more than that, those exponents, the exponents of the critical, the power laws, they are universal. We find them across many different systems. We call them critical exponents, and they do not depend on the microscopic details. So they are physically very different systems that just behave the same. We find the same numbers all over the place. So the idea that the brain may be critical or near critical was very appealing to scientists because it would mean that we can infer things about the underlying neural dynamics without having to know the microscopic details. The ionic channels, the transmitters, the synapses, all those details, maybe we can tell something without having to know those details. That was the key motivation. So, around the end of the 80s, an interesting idea was introduced, this idea of self-organized criticality. Not only that there is a critical temperature or a critical value of a certain parameter where the system becomes critical, some systems can actually self-organize to become critical. And that's why we might see them abundant in nature. So one example was, if you take a pile of rice or sand, it started with sand, and you just keep on dropping grains of sand, or in this case rice, at some point you will start to see avalanches of sand or rice. And it turns out that the sizes of these avalanches obey a power law. So here, P of S is the probability of getting a certain size. S is the size of the avalanche. And it turns out that there are, like earthquakes, many small avalanches, fewer intermediate, and very few large avalanches. But the way it falls off is a power law. And later on, people started to speculate whether we can find such phenomena in the brain. Or could criticality arise in the brain from local interactions among neurons? And will we see those avalanches of neural activity, which we now term neuronal avalanches? Will they obey the same power law distribution? I hope I'm not losing you. It might be somewhat intimidating because it's very new to people outside the world of physics. And here's to illustrate what we mean by power laws. So imagine that human height would be distributed like a power law. In reality, it's not. It's a Gaussian, but a normal distribution. But assume that in every 100 people, one of them would be 2 meters high. If it was a power law with this formula, s to the power of -2, then people that are at the height of 20 meters, of course they would be more rare, but we would see them 1 in 10,000, so 1 in every city. And 1 in a million, 1 in a state, or a few in a state, would be at the height of 200 meters. We would see them from very far away. So the idea is that those large avalanches, they are not that rare. They're actually there. They happen. Okay, so this was a mathematical introduction, sort of. Still have to introduce some concepts. So this idea of the critical brain dynamics was introduced about 2 decades ago, and there are now many experimental and theoretical studies that support this idea. So there's evidence, experimental, from small cultures of neurons to large-scale human brain activity. And we assume that the brain operates on this border between premature termination of activity propagation and exponential blow-up. It's like an atomic bomb that is kept subcritical, below the critical mass, but it could go supercritical and blow up if we have too much excitation. So in this context, the parameter that is interesting is not the temperature, like in some physical systems, it's what we call the neural gain. So if the gain is small, activity would die down. If the gain is too high, activity would blow up. And intermediate gain would be 1. So to illustrate that, here, assume that this gain, which we denote by the letter sigma, is smaller than 1. This means that if one neuron is active, on average, it activates less than 1 neuron in the next time step, and so on and so forth, so the activity would die out. On the other hand, if sigma is larger than 1, too much amplification, we would have this blow-up of activity. Activity would just grow like a chain reaction. So somewhere there is this sweet spot, the area where sigma is not far from 1, it's close to 1, or we believe that in real brains it's slightly below 1. Then we have this critical or near-critical dynamics. So cascades can actually be prolonged, but they will stop eventually, and activity would not blow up. And because things are probabilistic, we have some distribution. Not all cascades are of the same size. And theory predicts that for critical systems, when the gain is around 1, so when a group of neurons is active, it activates a group of about the same size down the road. That's the idea. Then the distribution of those cascades, like small earthquakes in the brain, that is expected to be a power law with a specific exponent of negative 3/2. That's the theory. Okay, I wanted to show a simulation. It doesn't work here, but we can reproduce this behavior in simulations of neural networks, and if we measure this distribution of avalanche sizes, we indeed find a power law with this exponent of negative 1.5. So again, this is the size of avalanches, of cascades of activity, of neural activity, and this is the probability of getting a particular size. And it just goes down, and this is log-log scale, so it's a straight line in log-log scale. It's a power law. So this is in a simulation, but will we see that in real life? Turns out that yes. I have to run in terms of the time. So these were results from 2003 in cortical cultures, and this was nice evidence that the avalanche sizes behave like a power law with an exponent of negative 1.5. Later, I was a postdoc of Dietmar Plants, actually Tara was too, and I could show that if we take human data, in this case this was magnetoencephalography, MEG data, we again could apply the avalanche analysis and found that we obtained this power law with the same exponent. It was not a real surprise, we expected that because we knew that it's a scale-free phenomenon, so you should see it at all scales, from the millimeters to the large-scale human brain activity. But now what can we do with that? It turns out that if we look at the cortical culture, if we just have a healthy culture, that's the black one, no drug, we get this nice power law. But now, if we block the excitation using some pharmacological agents, it's not really blocking, it's just reducing the excitation, we would get the light blue curve, which falls off very steeply, so we don't see the large avalanches. We block and we call this subcritical. If we block the inhibition, what we find is what we term supercritical behavior. So in this case, we see that there are some small avalanches, but then we don't see the intermediate ones, because once they started to propagate, they actually propagate across the whole system, and we have this kind of bump, which means that there are many avalanches of relatively large size. And that's the signature of epilepsy. And the culture actually becomes epileptic-like. So the avalanche analysis is very sensitive to imbalance of excitation inhibition, because in these cases, the pharmacological agents were very small concentrations were used, actually, so it was not complete blocking. Now, I think in the interest of time, I'll skip this slide. So what I want to show in a moment is that we can connect those ideas to some deviations from criticality. We can connect it to brain disorders. So here I put on the left side a system which is inhibition dominated or subcritical, and I put the way here for more inhibition, and on the right side excitation dominated system, supercritical case. So on the left side we have premature termination of activity, and here on the right side exponential growth and potentially high synchrony. Now the left side could manifest, as I said earlier, as disorders of consciousness, like vegetative state or minimally conscious. And on the right side, we can have epileptic seizures or hallucinations. So I was very interested and curious to see if we could actually find that in real data from those patients. Now, in the interest of time, I will not go into the details of the avalanche analysis, but it's essentially, we take those EEG signals in the context of EEG, we discretize them, we just turn them into a sequence of discrete events, and we cluster them into spatio-temporal cascades. So the details do not really matter, but we can actually apply the analysis and extract the gain parameter, so we can estimate the neural gain and the exponent. And it's also important to note that there's a certain time-scale parameter which is very important for the analysis. Essentially, what we assume is that if there are two consecutive events that are below this time scale, they belong to the same avalanche. If the separation between them is above this time scale, we assume that they belong to separate avalanches. So this parameter actually affects the analysis. And in my lab, we also proposed a multi-scale view where we study the behavior of the analysis across different values of the time scale. I'm getting really short on time. What we show here, this is a plot of the exponent which we denote by alpha and the gain parameter which we denote by sigma for different time scales. What you can see, these are EEG data from humans, and you can see that the curve passes through the point 1, negative 1.5, which is expected by the theory. We have the same behavior in MEG, magnetoencephalography data. What we propose is not to look just at this point that is consistent with the theory, but also with the behavior of the whole curve across different time scales. And it gives us some kind of multi-scale parameters. And we actually estimate the slope of the curve and the intercept of this curve. And from that we derive additional measures or metrics of the neural dynamics. What I want to show you, I'll skip this slide, is that these are actually interesting measures and are useful. So what you see here, this is an analysis of sleep deprivation data. So those subjects were sleep deprived for 36 hours, that's the x-axis time, and then they had a recovery sleep of 8 hours. What you see is that the neural gain increased in the course of sleep deprivation with some circadian envelope, and then dropped down after the recovery sleep. But even more than that, if we plot the neural gain, it's an EEG-based metric of neural activity, and the reaction time in a certain task, psychomotor vigilance task, we can see that they are correlated. So higher neural gain predicts higher longer reaction time. Yeah. Some results from epilepsy. Here each point represents a control subject, and these are resting state data, and these are different measures of criticality. And in red you see the patient, and they go in this supercritical direction. The fact that all the values are higher means that their brain, even in resting state, this is not during a seizure, it already shows the signature of higher excitability. I'll skip that slide too. Okay. But even within the same patient, if we take and compare pre-ictal dynamics to interictal dynamics, interictal is at least 4 hours away from the seizure. Pre-ictal is defined in our data 1 hour before the seizure. We can see marked differences. This is one of those measures that we extract from the multi-scale perspective. And we have a bunch of measures that show differences between pre-ictal and inter-ictal dynamics. We'll not go into them, but there's a bunch of them, and similarly we find for other disorders. So these are, for example, schizophrenia patients. We find differences in resting state activity between those patients and control subjects. We have also found differences in MCI, mild cognitive impairment, and also in disorders of consciousness. For example, the gain metric shows that vegetative states, minimally conscious, emerging from minimally conscious, are all subcritical states compared to control subjects. But even more than that, if we look at the multi-scale perspective, we find that they can actually discriminate between different levels of consciousness, between different disorders. Yeah, this is the main take-home message. But now we are trying to go even beyond that, not just to assess. I didn't show you that we can actually assess, and we are not there yet. We have to show that beyond sensitivity, we can also show some specificity, and we have some evidence for that, but work in progress. But we're also trying to do neurofeedback. So for example, we can take the neural gain parameter, and we can train subjects, for example, to reduce it, to reduce the gain. We also apply sequence of some cognitive tasks to see how it affects visual working memory, visual search, for example. And so far, we have some preliminary results showing that subjects can indeed downregulate the neural gain in the course of a few days of training on this neurofeedback. And that the behavioral consequences that we measure are also consistent with what we expect from a system that goes subcritical, that gets away from the critical point to lower values. So I'll try to summarize now. What I wanted to show you some evidence that MEG and EG data from humans show the signature of neuronal avalanches and support this hypothesis of the critical brain. We have it for both resting and evoked, which I did not show here. And it's interesting to see that the avalanche metrics indicate a shift towards an excitation-dominated state during sleep deprivation, also during inter-ictal activity in epileptic patients, but it also indicates subcritical dynamics in patients with disorders of consciousness. The multi-scale measure can improve the sensitivity even furthermore. I will skip those, but we find some evidence for our fingerprints. But if we look at a set of those multi-scale criticality measures, it's like a blood test. And we see a pattern of the measure which is different from one disorder to another. And I showed you some preliminary results for neurofeedback on the gain parameter, which could be helpful in sleep deprivation, in epilepsy, and other cases. And that's it. I'd like to thank my lab, in particular Tomer Fekete, who did most of the work that I showed here, the work on multi-scale criticality. Nir did the work on the neurofeedback, and Oshrit, who doesn't like to put her photos, did some of the work on epilepsy that I showed earlier. So thank you very much for listening, and